With us from Auckland is Kate Storrs. Kate is a senior lecturer in the School of Psychology at the University of Auckland, conducting research at the intersection of psychology, neuroscience and AI. Her work uses machine learning models to understand how our brains learn to make sense of the constant stream of visual information that bombards them. Kate has a PhD in the study of human visual perception from the University of Queensland, spent time in the past decade working as a researcher in London, Cambridge and Germany, and briefly as a data scientist at Twitter. And without further ado, Kate Storrs.
Thank you very much to Marta and the rest of the Hub for inviting me to give this talk. It's been a really cool day seeing all the work that is being done here. I think you're all very fortunate here. You have an amazingly well-equipped research environment. We're campaigning to get an OPM MEG set up in Auckland, but we can only dream of 70 fMRI. Seems like a very rich place to do research. So I'm interested in visual understanding, how we understand the world through sight, not just how we recognize familiar objects or faces, but the kind of visual understanding you'd have even if you were transported to an alien landscape with strange 3D objects that you'd never seen before. You would be capable of understanding the relationships between objects in that environment. You'd be capable of navigating it. That sort of core scene understanding, shape understanding, is what I think is the foundation of our visual intelligence, our visual abilities, and is what I'm interested in understanding and modeling computationally as a researcher. For example, if we see an image like this, it might not bring to mind any object names. We might not be able to put a label to the things, but nevertheless, we have a very rich understanding of what's going on in this image. We understand the shapes of these different surfaces. We understand that different parts of it are made of different materials, maybe in different states, maybe different things have caused them to be polished or dull. We understand for certain elements of the image what caused that dark patch or those bright spots. That might look like a cast shadow. These bright splotches here might look like reflected lights from somewhere else. So we understand not only what we're looking at, but what factors in the world caused the appearance of the things that we're seeing at this very fundamental level of shape and material and lighting. And this is a great computational feat because the local features produced by all these different causes are locally very visually similar. You know, an edge created by an object boundary looks very similar to one created by a cast shadow or one created by a bend in an object. So it's very hard to derive this understanding because the local features are ambiguous, and this is the sort of decades-long challenge of computer vision. And yet I think this sort of scene understanding, object understanding is the foundation of vision. It's what allows us to interact and navigate with the world and gives us this really rich description upon which we can then start learning things like object names and face names and so on. Okay, so that's the research question that I'm interested in. Meanwhile, in computer vision, there has been spectacular progress over the last 10 years in creating artificial systems that have some really impressive visual capabilities. So computer vision is not new. Even neural networks are not new. Neural networks are systems that have been around since the 40s. They're loosely inspired by the brain in that they're made up of interconnected little elements, and each element is like a sort of cartoon simplified version of what a neuron is doing mathematically. They take in inputs from other units or from sensory inputs, they weight them, they combine them, and then they pass them through some nonlinearity. So they're like a little mathematical abstraction of a neuron, and you can wire lots of them together and use automatic algorithms like backpropagation to get that network to learn some useful mapping between its input data and the outputs. That concept is not new, but what is new is the ability to stack hundreds, literally hundreds of layers of these together and successfully train them end to end on vast image data sets in order to do tasks that have real-world utility. You know, train them on 1.2 million images scraped from the internet and then be able to take that system and use it to help your Google search performance or to help guide your self-driving car or to scan your CCTV footage for people of interest. All of those capabilities have only really arisen in the last 5 to 10 years. And as visual neuroscientists, of course, we've been very interested in the sudden boom in capability of these brain-inspired networks. The obvious question that lots of people have been asking over the last 10 years, including me, is how good are these engineering solutions, these deep neural network models that software engineers have devised, how good are they as models of the human visual system? Might they have converged on a similar sort of set of computations, for example, because they have this hierarchical nature where they go from the image up through a series of sort of increasingly complex visual features, eventually to some useful visual decision like which object is in an image. Might they have converged on some computational steps that are similar to what the brain does? So lots of people have approached this question from lots of different methodological angles. We've talked a little bit today about decoding models, not so much about encoding models, but both in terms of encoding and decoding, deep neural network models that are trained on object recognition are the best bag of features we have available to either decode neural activity. So if you want to stick electrodes in a brain and decode what image the visual system is seeing, or put someone in an fMRI scanner and observe their multivoxel pattern of activity and decode what image that person is seeing. The best way to do that is to get a deep neural network and learn a mapping between the high-level complex visual features in the deep neural network and the voxels in the brain. So they're the best decoding tools we have. Also the best encoding tools. If you want to take an image and predict what pattern of brain activity it's going to give rise to, if you want to predict how much an individual neuron in a monkey's brain is going to spike when you show this new picture that's never seen before, you can do an impressively good job by learning a mapping on other images between the features in a deep neural network and the spiking of neurons. Another method which I've been more involved in is assessing the similarity between deep neural networks and the human brain using representational similarity analysis, which is a multivoxel pattern analysis method. So since there's been quite a lot of papers giving using this method to assess the similarity of DNNs and brains, since it's me giving this talk, I'll tell you a little bit about one of the papers that I was involved in. This was work I did with Nico Kriegersgottir at the CBU in Cambridge. So representational similarity analysis is a way of comparing the internal representations within two systems that might have very different units to one another. So you can't directly compare the units in an artificial neural network to the voxel cubes in a human brain. But what you can do is describe both of those systems at a more abstract level in terms of which images they represent as being similar to one another and which they represent as being dissimilar, and then compare those. So to compare a brain and a deep neural network, you get the same set of images, you feed it to your neural network at the bottom, and you also show it to human participants in an fMRI scanner. From the fMRI scanner, for each voxel of the brain area that you're interested in, you get a little estimate of the neural activity within each voxel in that area. And sort of analogously within the deep neural network, you can pick a particular place in the network, like a particular processing layer, and record the activity of every unit, every artificial neuron in that layer. And then to be able to compare these two, you first do the step of re-expressing them in terms of similarity matrices. So the rows and the columns of each matrix are the stimuli that you showed, the images that you showed, and then the color value within the matrix expresses how similar the overall pattern of activity, either in the brain or in the deep neural network, was to those two images. So you see a strong blue diagonal there where each image compared to itself elicits the same activity pattern, so they're very low dissimilarities, and then off at the edges you might have stimuli that are represented as being quite different from one another. And the idea here is now we've got the data in exactly the same format. We've got a dissimilarity matrix for both systems, and we can directly correlate those two matrices together and measure whether these two visual systems are grouping images in similar ways. So that was the method that we took. We were interested in this project. I think we began it in 2017-ish. So there had been this sort of first wave of visual neuroscience papers having quite positive results, comparing individual deep neural networks that had been trained on object recognition to the human brain or to macaque electrophysiological data. But meanwhile, the software engineers had come up with this plethora of new architectures that range from like 8 layers to, what was the biggest we had, 201 layers. Some of them had just a single processing stream. Some of them had all of these branching and skipping connections. And some of them were much better at the task of object recognition than others. So we were interested in, are there differences in how well these very diverse architectures perform as models of the human brain? So we considered these 9 architectures that spanned sort of 6 years of the deep neural network engineering progress and 8 to 201 layers. And then we systematically compared each layer in each network with the human fMRI data from, this is like a broad area and late ventral stream, broadly sort of human inferior temporal cortex. So each of these subplots shows the results for a different network architecture. The blue lines show how similar each layer of the network's representation was to the representation in the human brain. And the gray lines show the same estimate, but for a network that hasn't been trained on anything. It's just been like randomly initialized, and then you grab it and test it, which seems like a bit of a weird thing to do, but it provides a useful baseline because it's tempting to think that the power of the deep neural network to correlate well with the brain is something about the particular features it's learned. So as a kind of sanity check or baseline, we like to compare also an untrained version of the same network. So you generally see trained networks are much better than untrained ones. The similarity to these late ventral stream areas peaks in kind of mid to late areas of the network, layers of the network, and then plummets at the very end. And that makes sense because all of these networks are trained to classify objects. So at the very final layer, what they're all arriving at is a vector that has 1,000 numbers corresponding to each of the 1,000 categories of objects that this network has been trained to know about. And the output is like 0, 0, 0, 1, 0, 0, 0, 0, etc., indicating which one object category this image best corresponds to. And that's unlikely to be a representation that captures all of the kind of graded similarities that we perceive and represent between objects. It's a representation in which an armchair is exactly as dissimilar from a cat as a cat is from a lion, and so on. So that's why it plummets at the very end. And then, as well as considering just the trained networks, we went a step further to say, what if these neural networks have learned the right visual features, but not in the right proportions? Presumably the features represented in the human visual system are influenced strongly by the statistics of our training diet, which are very different from the statistics of these 1,000-way object classification networks, and they're probably also influenced by behavioral importance or semantics, behavioral relevance, linguistic relevance. So we said, okay, let's take the visual features inside these networks, but we'll allow them to be reweighted linearly, just sort of linearly boosted or suppressed in order to better predict the brain data. And we did this in a cross-validated way where we fit on one bunch of participants and images and then test on totally separate participants and images. And these fitted versions of the model match the brain data much better than the unfitted models, which is not so surprising. And the main takeaway of this paper was that there are no significant differences between all of these very diverse deep neural network architectures once you've trained them on object recognition and allowed the features to be reweighted to better predict brain data. They're all very good models, mostly not perfect models in that they don't quite reach the noise ceiling, so that grey bar indicates the highest performance you could get given the individual variability in the human data. But for at least 3 of the models, they were not significantly different from the lower bound of the noise ceiling. So deep neural network models trained on object recognition seem to be the best predictors of representational similarity in cortex, and maybe slightly strangely, it doesn't seem to matter whether you have 8 layers or 201 layers. They've all got kind of a good bag of features for predicting, or for sort of capturing what images are represented similarly and dissimilarly in the brain. So you see I've got a little asterisk next to DNNs. I'm going to come back to that in a moment. But I just want to say there's also lots of people who would argue, no, deep neural networks are not good models of human vision. There's an excellent behavioral brain sciences article that was sort of preprint published earlier this year by Jeff Bowers and colleagues, and will presumably be coming out in the next couple of months, where they summarize the case against neural networks as being sort of adequate models of human vision. And they emphasize that most of the evidence for DNNs as being good models of human vision is based on these kind of machine learning data science benchmark kind of approaches, where you get the features in the model and you sort of twist and reweight and use encoding and decoding and so on models, and you find that it's possible to learn a good correspondence between the features and some internal estimate of brain activity. What's received much less attention in the research is behavioral comparisons, and there's lots of glaring failures of sort of behavioral similarity, like deep neural networks are not susceptible to most of the visual illusions and confusions that humans are. They have unintuitive failures of robustness, so a common sort of problem people point out is adversarial examples, which is that you can add tiny, tiny imperceptible amounts of pixel noise to images, and it will cause a network to completely change the classification from like a school bus to a gibbon, while a human cannot see the difference and it looks entirely like a school bus. So that seems like an unintuitive failure, and they've proved particularly disappointing in the sphere of sort of spatial reasoning, grouping, gestalt perception, these kinds of things. So if you ask them, is this shape inside another shape? Are these dots on a curly line connected to one another or not? It's pretty hard to get a neural network to do well at these tasks. So I think these are all good and important points. But the thing I want to focus on for the rest of the talk is that a lot of this work has been done on a very small subset of deep neural network. So deep neural network as a term sort of applies to just anything that has a big stack of lots of layers of these artificial neural units. But this first wave of deep neural networks in the engineering literature after sort of 2012 were predominantly feed-forward supervised object recognition DNNs. So feed-forward in the sense that they just do a single processing pass from image up to object label. There's no recurrence, no lateral connections, no temporal dynamics. And supervised in the sense that in order to get this network to adjust its weights in order to capture useful knowledge and do a useful task like object recognition, you need to provide it with the correct answers for thousands or millions of example images. So the classic task that all of our networks in that paper that I just talked about were trained on is called the ImageNet benchmark, ImageNet large-scale visual recognition challenge. It's an international machine learning competition where the organizers publish 1.2 million images of objects in cluttered backgrounds scraped from the internet. Each one contains one predominant object, and each training image is provided with its accompanying label. So they give you, an image and say, this is an accordion, this is a fire hydrant, etc. You use those to train your model. by letting it cycle through these millions of images multiple times, receiving the label and adjusting its weights until it gets better at giving you that label. And once you've done that, you end up with a network that can generalize pretty well to new images that it's never seen before, but of course it can't sort of spontaneously learn new object categories or anything. It's a thing recognizer. It can't report anything else about an image, and it can't spontaneously learn a new category of thing. It just knows about the 1,000 objects, and the only thing it can report about any image is which of the 1,000 objects that image contains. And I think this is, obviously human vision can recognize things. Thing recognition is one of the things we do, but I think it's a tiny, tiny part of human and sort of animal in general vision. This point was made already more than 20 years ago by Ted Adelson in what turned out to be a sort of influential paper in the material perception crowd, where he criticized computer vision at the time for ignoring materials and shapes and the stuff of the world. Often human perception isn't particularly interested in the object label. We're interested in the state or the stuff or the substance in an image, and this is something that's been sort of historically and continues to be relatively neglected in computer vision. So I would say that our core visual understanding, all that stuff I was talking about at the beginning of understanding the shape and the scene layout and the material and the lighting, is particularly unlikely to be learned through labeled supervised training. We do sometimes get told the name of an object, but we basically never get told the exact curvature of a surface or the exact reflectance and color of an object. Those are things that somehow our brains make sense of through our own visual experience. So I would say that the brain has some way of spontaneously, in a data-driven way, picking up on the structures in images that matter, which are probably, I'm particularly interested in the sort of mid-level properties like shading gradients and highlights and so on, which give clues about properties of the outside world, like curvature and reflectance and so on. So this way of describing vision makes it sound a lot like, in machine learning terms, an unsupervised learning objective. So unsupervised learning is where you still feed your network a bunch of images and you still iteratively train it to get better at some task through something like backpropagation, but you don't provide any extraneous labels along with your images. You just specify a task which allows the network to learn about the statistical structure within the images itself. And there's all sorts of proxy tasks that can be used in unsupervised learning to encourage a network to learn the statistical structure. Common ones are learning to efficiently compress image data. So somebody earlier on asked a question about autoencoders. Autoencoders are a type of network that has an architecture where they start off sort of at the size of the image, and then the layers get smaller and smaller until there's a bottleneck that's of much lower dimensionality than the image. And then they gradually get bigger and bigger again in this hourglass shape. And the task of the network is to reconstruct the original image at the output of the network after having compressed it down into this bottleneck. So in order to be able to do that task well, the network is going to have to learn an efficient high-level summary of the structure in the image. Likewise, you can do this by spatial prediction. So if you have a network guess the pixel value, the RGB color of a pixel as it moves across the image, or you occlude parts of the image and get it to reconstruct what it thinks is behind there. That's another way of encouraging a network to learn about the structure in images. And you can also do this over time. So you can train a network to take in video frames if it's a recurrent network. If it has temporal dynamics, it can take in video frames and then predict what's going to happen next, what the pixels in the next video frame are going to be. And I should point out that these unsupervised learning objectives are unbelievably good, incredibly good at capturing structure in images. So this is DALL-E generating visualizations of my title, Learning About the World by Learning About Images. Both the image generation and the text generation networks are trained in mostly unsupervised ways by predicting the next character in huge corpuses of text, which ends up somewhat magically giving you extremely sophisticated natural language processing, or in these cases, for image generating networks, they usually use latent diffusion, which involves adding noise and removing noise from images in order to learn about the local structure of images. So unsupervised objectives are incredibly good at capturing rich structure in images and text. So my research interests over the last kind of 5 years have shifted from the work I was doing thinking about whether the current sort of crop of feed-forward supervised thing recognition networks are good models of human vision, to thinking about a different class of network that learns through unsupervised learning, and thinking about whether these incredibly powerful statistical learning tools can give us some inroad into how the human brain forms perceptual dimensions and perceptual categories by asking whether these unsupervised learning networks discover something like human-like perceptual dimensions and categories from visual experience. And I'm going to talk about 2 projects, probably in fairly brief detail, which implement and pursue this idea. The first one is in the context of static images, a network that learns the structure in static images, and we then explore it to see whether it's learned a perceptual dimension of glossiness, which is a dimension of material appearance. And in the second case, we have a recurrent network that predicts video frames, and we probe it to see whether it's learned the categorical distinction between matte, textured things and mirrored, reflective things. And these, sort of in themselves, these are very niche questions, you know, understanding human perception of reflection and glossiness. But I think there's a lot of mileage in these kind of mid-level visual areas at the moment, because they're tractable. You can really carefully specify what the features in the image are and how they're related to human perception of it. Okay, so this first project was published a couple of years ago now with Roland Fleming, who I worked with in Germany, and Bart, who I've just been visiting down in Sydney. The workflow in this project and in most of my projects is that we start by rendering our own data set. So rather than taking noisy, cluttered natural photograph images, we strip down the visual problem to some really constrained environment. In this case, we stripped it down to top-down views of bumpy surfaces, which we can render with physically based physically based rules about how light bounces off surfaces, in this case using the Unity game engine. We then use those big sets of rendered images as the training data for unsupervised and other deep neural networks. And then ultimately we use human psychophysics, human behavioral data to adjudicate which of these models has learned something like a kind of human-like perception of gloss and material and lighting and so on. So in this particular case, we had a factor that varied, which was the reflectance of the surface. So gloss is kind of loosely physically related to the concept of specular reflectance, which is whether a surface reflects the light diffusely, like scatters the light off in all directions, in which case you have a matte surface, like on the right-hand side, or it bounces off in a tight angle proportionate to the angle that it came in at, in which case you have reflections and highlights and the appearance of glossiness like on the left. So we had both of these types of surface, and then we threw in lots of random variation in the color, in the lighting environment that the surface was in the orientation of the light with respect to the surface, and in the actual geometry of how bumpy the surface was and where those bumps were. So we end up with a training data set of 10,000 images, of which these are some examples. So there's a lot of variability, but it's also a very constrained problem, which we hope makes the representations that the network learns more tractable than if we were to use more cluttered images. And we then use those 10,000 images as the training data for an unsupervised network. This network architecture is called Pixel VAE. It's a combination of VAE, variational autoencoder, and Pixel CNN, which is an autoregressive network. So the VAE part compresses images into a small bottleneck, and the Pixel CNN part tries to spatially predict the next pixel in an image given the previous ones. So it's combining two streams, combines an autoencoder bottleneck stream, which ends in this very compressed representation, just 10 numbers. And I'm going to call that the latent code, and that's where I'm going to be sort of examining later on. And then it has this other stream which does spatial prediction, and the ultimate training objective of the network is to learn a good probabilistic model of the pixels in the images so that it can generate plausible new samples that didn't exist in the training data. And it's pretty good at that. Here are some examples of its generated images. They're not absolutely perfect, but at a glance they look very much like the images in the training data set, but these are new samples. This exact combination of bumps and reflectance and so on never existed in the training data set. So what we were interested in from this exercise was to see whether in this latent code, in this internal summarized representation that the network had been forced to learn, does that representation capture information about the sort of world properties, which in this case are the properties of the rendering engine that created these surfaces. So for example, does it capture the glossiness of a surface? So here I'm visualizing each dot is a new image, an image that the network wasn't trained on, and I've fed these, I think it's about 1,000 images into the network, recorded their activation in that latent code, and I've then used this method, TSNE, to visualize which images are nearby, which other ones in a two-dimensional display. And I've color-coded them by whether the dot corresponded to an image that was high gloss or low gloss. And you'll see that the low gloss things all kind of cluster together in this big blob, and then the high gloss things do something curious of creating all these separate little islands. We'll come to understand why that is in a moment, but first just a sort of sanity check to say that this clustering wasn't apparent in the images themselves. It's not that all the glossy images were brighter than all the matte images, for example. If you look at the clustering in the pixel space, everything is totally intermingled. Okay, so it seems to cluster high gloss and low gloss things separately, but has this weird subclustering. But we found that if we recolor this embedding by the light field that these surfaces were illuminated by, so the light fields are things like this surface is simulated as being in a forest or in a church or at a beach. And each of those separate light fields corresponded to a separate cluster among the high gloss things, which makes sense because high gloss things reflect their environment, so the lighting environment that they're in is going to have a larger impact on the appearance of glossy than matte things. And beautifully, if we recolor code by the orientation that the light field is in relative to the surface, we see this lovely smooth graded similarity where nearby points in the latent space correspond not only to similar materials, not only to similar light fields, but also to similar orientations of lighting. And this isn't true in a supervised model. So we also had a model of the same architecture, roughly like the same number of layers, but we explicitly trained it to tell us whether a surface was matte or glossy. It does that readout, basically perfectly, like 99.8% accuracy. It very strongly separates high gloss and low gloss things in its internal space, but it doesn't represent any of these other distinctions like light field or light field orientation. So it's not something that trivially comes out of feeding these images through a fancy neural network. So that was our first main result, that these world factors like lighting and material spontaneously emerge in the latent code of this powerful statistical learning machine. One of the challenges of working with unsupervised networks is that they don't give you an immediate readout of the thing that you might be interested in. So you can't feed in an image and have it say directly, this is what's in the image or this is how glossy the image is. You have to treat it a little bit more like a brain and do some kind of decoding analysis if you want to figure out sort of how it's representing a new image. So we wanted to get quantitative gloss predictions. We wanted to be able to feed in an image and say, this is how glossy our network thinks this image is. And we did it by using a support vector machine, a simple classifier, to find the direction in this latent space that best separated glossy from matte things. And that allowed us to, for any new image, see where that image fell along this axis. So we can say this one falls far on the glossy side, so it's really glossy. This one falls kind of on the boundary, so it's kind of ambiguous, and so on. So we managed to get numbers assigned to new images, and we did a experimental test of how good those numbers were by rendering 50 new surfaces of random gloss levels, having 20 human participants rate them on a scale of 1 to 6, how glossy is this surface. That's on the y-axis, and compared that to the model's prediction, which is on the x-axis, and it's remarkably good. Not only remarkably good, but it's also better than any of the alternative predictors that we considered, like the ground truth, which is the reflectance parameter in the actual rendering model, or the supervised network. Okay, so we can get predictions that seem pretty good of human perceived gloss for novel images. That's good, but the real kind of test of a model of vision is that it shouldn't just broadly be able to do something that humans can broadly do. It should have some of the same quirks or idiosyncrasies as the human visual system. And thankfully, the human visual system has loads of quirks. We used this sort of well-known failure of gloss constancy to probe our model. So constancy is our visual system's ability to see the properties of the world, the properties of objects, as staying the same even when the environment or the circumstances change. So if you are holding an object and you wander from one room into another, or you go outside, you would hopefully see the material of that object as staying the same. It wouldn't suddenly seem to be metallic outside, but made of porcelain in here, for example. So that would be good material constancy, but we also have some pretty well-known failures of material constancy. So these 3 images are made of exactly the same stuff. They're rendered from a 3D physics engine, but they're rendered with exactly the same reflectance properties on the surface. The only thing that's changing is that the surface is getting bumpier towards the right. And hopefully you find that the surface on the right looks shinier, sparklier, glossier than the surface on the left. So we generated lots of these sequences where we kept the real material the same, but we changed the bumpiness of the surface, and we first measured the network's prediction of how gloss should change. So if it had correct gloss constancy, it should just predict the same thing for all of these. Instead, for most of them, it predicted rising gloss as things got more bumpy, which we know is the pattern that mostly humans follow. But we thought it was important to also give it a little bit of a harder time by asking it to find sequences within which it predicted more complex patterns, like that they get glossier intermediate bump heights and then decline. So we selected 20 of those sequences, and we then measured human data, got humans to report the relative gloss of all of these sequences, and we found in all cases that the humans qualitatively agreed with the shape of the model's predictions. And again, we found that the unsupervised model better predicted human gloss perception than any of a bunch of alternative models. So the exciting thing about that for us was that it's a proof of principle that by doing some sophisticated statistical learning of the visual features in images, you can end up arriving at something like at a perceptual dimension that isn't trivial. It's our perception of gloss is relatively well understood in terms of how it relates to the properties of highlights and so on, but it's not trivial to summarize that in a simple image statistic. Most models and image statistics fail to predict human gloss perception well, but just by learning the statistics of a bunch of different images of different materials, this network had picked up on that dimension. Okay, lots more details in the paper. Okay, I'm going to give a whirlwind tour of the second project, which is similar in spirit, but ventures into the temporal domain. So we would, obviously it's very unrealistic to think that we're just learning the structure of static images. The world moves around, we move around, and that temporal dimension gives us loads of experience, loads of new visual information. So temporal information for us is very important for disambiguating shape and material. So when you see an image like this, you probably assume it comes from that it's sort of generated by a scene like this, where you've got a very reflective object mirroring some complex environment, probably looks like reflections. But it's also technically possible that it's a totally matte surface that someone has deviously painted a very complex pattern of sort of texture markings onto. Now, it's kind of hard to imagine that second possibility when they're static, but if you let these objects move, they move very differently from one another. If a marking on a surface is caused by a reflection and the object moves, it's going to slide and slip and expand across that surface. So on the left, you should get a much more vivid impression of reflection mirrorness, whereas on the right, if it's a texture marking, it's going to stay stuck to that surface, and hopefully you get an impression of it being dull and matte and having a texture painted onto it. So for humans, the temporal cues to material and shape as well really override whatever our initial sort of assumption about it on the basis of a static image was. So we wanted to see whether an unsupervised network that just learned the sort of temporal dynamics of moving objects could spontaneously learn that there were these two different types of thing, these systematic differences in how markings on a surface move when they're due to a reflection versus when they're due to a texture. For this, we used a video prediction network. I know quite a few people here are interested in predictive learning, so I'm looking forward to talking to people tomorrow about predictive coding models. There's PredNet, which is a deep neural network implementation of Rao and Ballard's predictive coding principles. I have tried using it. It's just not as good a video prediction network as some of the other things in machine learning. So for this project, I ended up using a video prediction network that sort of, at the time when I started the project, was fairly state-of-the-art in video prediction. And it does an excellent job. So we generated 10,000 little video clips, just 20 frames of things like the left-hand side shows actual video clips. We trained the network to take in frames, predict the next frame. So you feed it first frame, it predicts second. You feed it the second, it predicts the third, and so on, for 10,000 little video clips. And then at the end of training, you can test it on new video clips. These are ones that it never saw during training. But when its predicted frames are compiled into a little GIF like this, they're impressively accurate, impressively faithful to what actually happens in the real frames. So if the network can learn its objective, our question, though, is, has it spontaneously discovered that there are these two different types of material? And to do that, we're going to use TSNE to visualize it again, same as before. The only difference here is, so I'm feeding it about 500 new videos. I'm color coding it by whether the real object in the video was a matte textured thing or a mirrored, shiny, reflective thing. But I'm doing the same analysis at each frame of the video. So at the first frame, these things are pretty intermixed, and then as the network gets more information, as the object moves over time, they come to be more and more cleanly separated. So indeed, it does seem to spontaneously cluster, as in have different population activities to matte versus mirrored things. You can see that also in the decoding. So if you train a decoder to try to tell which material is this, or what shape is the object, how fast is it moving, what texture pattern does it have, all of those things can be decoded very above chance, almost perfectly for material after a few frames. So the information about these world properties is present within the network. Okay, so first result, it seems to have learned this distinction implicitly between reflection markings and texture markings spontaneously. And then the last thing we did was we wanted to look at its sensitivity to the static cues to material versus motion cues to material. So we used stimuli like these weird stuck-on reflections to see what it made of them. So we know we can decode material pretty much perfectly. When you feed it the first frame of a little video like this, it decodes both a mirror thing, a sticky reflection thing, and a static thing as being strongly reflective. That makes sense. That's what the sort of static cues imply. But then as you feed them more frames from these videos, the actual mirror things in orange, which are sliding across the surface, remain decoded strongly as mirror things, whereas the stuck-on reflections switch over to being decoded as matte things, much as human perception does. There's a slight quirk here that it also thinks that static things are matte. I think that's because in its training data set, it didn't have any static things. Those are their sort of odd aberrations. We're including those in the next training set. And you can not only do this decoding at the sort of whole population level, you can see it within individual units. If you do a kind of in silico electrophysiology and you see the activity of individual units in the network to either mirrored or matte things, you find a lot of individual units that have strong preferences for particular shapes or lightings or materials. So the distinction does spontaneously arise, and it exists both at the population and the single unit levels, and it seems to integrate both the static and the motion cues to material. So all of these are promising signs, I think, that there's a lot more to deep neural networks in computational vision science than sort of assessing whether off-the-shelf object recognition thing recognizers are good models of the human brain. It's also just a really powerful toolkit to do statistical learning on whatever visual data or whatever sort of modality of data that you're interested in, and extract really high-level statistics from that data that aren't really, derivable by hand or from any other method that we have access to, and then to start systematically mapping out how those high-level statistics might relate to the sorts of things that the human visual system, or eventually auditory or tactile and so on system, has learned from its sensory experience. And rather than I have a couple of sort of theoretical pieces where we flesh out these ideas a bit more, if you're interested in this sort of thing. For now, though, thank you very much for having me and for inviting me today.
So it's not surprising to me that thing recognition and supervised learning don't do as good of a job, because from a developmental perspective, that's not the purpose that our visual system is serving.
Yeah.
And so labeling often comes quite late in development, right? Where you pair an object with a word and you can reiterate that word. Oftentimes you're paying attention to what's important in your environment because of the utility of it or comparison with other things. To what extent do you think these models can use human development to create some kind of, learning structure that's actually about the utility of an object, or even the association of the object with another person or something like that, that we would actually use to pay attention to our environment from a visual perspective?
There's a really nice paper by Lauren Sloan and Linda Smith called something like What Machine Learning Can Learn from Developmental Vision, which outlines all of the differences between the training data sets of thing recognition networks, which is like static snapshots totally disjointed of 1,000 different objects, versus developmental visual diets, which are in some ways very constrained in that we don't tend to see 1,000 objects every day. We see the same, sippy cup and hands and face of one or two people, but we see them over really extended temporal times. We stare at the same room, the same object over and over from all different angles. So it seems like infant vision trains really exhaustively on a very small number of objects, which I think is exactly the sort of training you need to learn things like shape constancy, to learn how an object's appearance changes over, lighting and view and so on changes. And once you've got that kind of core geometric kind of understanding, I think it's much easier to then sort of scaffold on object naming and so on. The other aspect of sort of behavioral relevance is also really interesting. That's not something that any of the models that I talked about factor in. Even the unsupervised models are totally passive learners. Their job is to predict the next video frame, for example, and every video frame is exactly as relevant as every other, where obviously for any animal, certainly some of our training is reinforcement learning, that it's really important to represent this thing and be able to detect this thing accurately. I think it's relatively easy to sort of model those things. It's just that the model space becomes very complex. You can sort of tag in, you can have multiple training objectives where you have to predict what the world looks like at the next moment, but you also have to gravitate towards interesting, unpredictable things, and you also have to gravitate towards the things that you get higher reward to. You can sort of incorporate all of these elements into a deep neural network that's controlling a little avatar inside a computer world. There's people working on this sort of thing. I think it's super exciting, and there's going to be a lot more incorporating that realism into unsupervised learning in like the next 10 years.
I had a question about what you talked about earlier about how diverse models can produce similar representations with neural structures in the brain. Do you see that as a good or a bad thing? Because you can really have such varying architectures, but they still produce similar representational similarity. And with Talia Conkla's work, you know, even architectures that don't even have convolutional operations can still have high correspondence. So, yeah, what's your take on that?
If you're interested in like encoding or decoding models, I think it's very heartening news for those kind of more applied uses of networks as tools, because it's not that there's one holy grail architecture out there that we've all got to find as a field. You can grab a lot of off-the-shelf engineering models, and they're going to be a good bag of features for doing encoding or decoding to fMRI data, for example. It certainly, like this project certainly kind of dampened my interest in exploring that architecture space, because I sort of thought, well, if, you know, I'm not sure whether it's that all of these networks are converging on similar visual features because they're all trained on the same task and therefore they're similarly, you know, good representational models, or if it's that the tool of comparing representational similarity in this sort of big swath of cortex is such a crude tool that we can't really differentiate between them. But either way, it seems like there's not a lot of low-hanging fruit in sort of searching for better architectures. I mean, there's the BrainScore project, which is a much more kind of comprehensive version of, you know, came along after we started this project, but is a more comprehensive version of this kind of idea where you can, they have like a benchmark data set of neural data from monkeys and I think some mice also, and you can submit models to it, and then there's like a leaderboard of the best architectures. So these searches are ongoing, and maybe, but you know, the top models in BrainScore as of like last year tend to be kind of weird engineering hacks. They're not like the most brain-inspired model architectures or anything. I don't know, I'm more interested in addressing these kind of behavioral comparisons at the moment, like figuring out what it is that we need to have good grouping and segmentation and all of this in sort of neuro-inspired models.